Solitude in Old Age, Is It a Bliss or Curse? By VMS. The prologue, the weight of morning, the first light arrived hesitant, brushing against the edges of the world like a visitor unsure of welcome. Mira sat by the window, teacup warming her palms, watching sunlight spill across the garden. She had tended in careful neglect. It was a garden of contradictions, roses clawed skyward, while weeds curled like stubborn memories. A single jasmine vine crept along the balcony railing, straining as if trying to remember who had once admired it. Solitude had once been sharp edged rebellion, now it was a patient, deliberate, unyielding. She could hear the house breathe, the walls exhaling decades of laughter and sorrow, observing her presence and her absence simultaneously. Letters unopened on her desk whispered their own urgencies. Friends, distant children, scattered voices she might never hear again. A sudden rapping at the door startled her. The neighbor, harsh faced and impatient, complained about encroaching plans. Mira smiled faintly, the absurdity of life's petty claims striking her. Even in complaint, the world demanded acknowledgement, connection, attention. The encounter was brief, yet it left a residue of tension that mingled with the morning light. Solitude, she realized, was both sanctuary and arena. In the quiet, she noticed the paradox. Absence did not erase life, rather, it amplified perception. Dust moths become dancing constellations, the faint hum of a teacup, a metronome to her own heartbeat. Even the ordinary attended to fully a glimmered morning was promise and reckoning alike. The world moved on indifferent to her presence, yet she could witness its fragile luminous details in ways no companionship could replicate. The first chapter, it is about the house that forgets. The house exhaled slowly, its groaning floorboards sighing under her weight, and sunlight fell in shafts, illuminating dust like suspended stars. Mira's eye traced familiar surfaces. The chair where she had nursed children, the desk where letters to absent friends had piled up. And she realized the walls remembered more faithfully than people. Her solitude was interrupted briefly by a visitor. A postal worker arrived with a notice for overdue bill. His glance lingered with mild judgment, unspoken yet heavy. She was alone, he assured, incapable. She thanked him, voice steady, though a flush of irritation rose. Small, invisible social judgments etched themselves on her consciousness, subtle pressures she had long ignored. The garden outside was a patchwork of resistance and neglect. Dandelions marched in formations, almost militant roses stretched toward sunlight, weeds curled like the fingers of memory. Even here, society's gaze penetrated through expectation. She observed a younger woman watching from afar, attempting to emulate her elegance, and wondered at their urgency to appear to perform vitality to hide the inevitable progression of time. A letter slipped from the mail, her daughter, brief lines of affection and guilt, apologizing for absence, hinting at hurry. Mira read it aloud. Regret and tenderness mingled in her chest. Absence, she realized, threaded through all her relationships, yet awareness and attention transformed into connection. Later, the kettle chirped and she laughed at herself. The absurdity struck her. The small, everyday sounds and interactions, letters, disputes, and errands, were a dance she could observe fully, and in observing, she could found vitality. The house, the garden, the distant world, all were partners in a solidarity but alternative life. The next chapter, it is about the echoes in the attic. The attic was a cathedral of dust and memory. Mira claimed the narrow stairs carefully, each step groaning under decades of weight, as if the house itself were whispering reminders of lives witnessed and forgotten. Sunlight pierced the grimy window, illuminating floating moths like tiny luminous spirits dancing impatiently. Boxes lined the walls, sealed with brittle tape and peeling labels and photographs letters and photographs, letters, dresses, a music box whose paint had chipped with age. She ran her fingers across the surfaces, feeling echoes of countless small lives stored here. Each box was a paradox. Absence contained presence. Fragility held resilience. And the music box sprang open at a gentle push. A tiny melody spilled, jagged and plaintive. Scratching at the air, Mira remembered her mother humming those small notes kneading dough while singing. Her voice a tender rebellion against silence. The memory brought warmth, yet the ache of loss was sharp. A paradox she had learned to carry with equanimity. A sudden knock startled her. A young neighbor had come fumbling for a borrowed ladder, anxious to retrieve a stranded kite. Their conversation was awkward but sincere, revealing generalization of contrast, urgency versus contemplation, action versus reflection. Mira realized that attention, patience, presence created bridges where society often built walls. A letter slipped from one box, yellowed and curled. She read it aloud, savoring its pauses, hearing the faint echo of friendship and longing. The attic was not silent. It hummed with testimony, insisting that knowledge the world often ignored. Below, a sparrow hopped along the garden wall. It passed, picked, and hopped again, unconcerned with human reflection. Nature's indifference was cruel yet instructive, persistent, unyielding, yet capable of inspiring clarity. Solitude, she realized, was a lens and crucible, sharpening perception, illuminating paradox, and revealing the life's miniature. The flutter of leaves, the creak of floorboards, and a fleeting smile were profoundly luminous. The next chapter it is about the world beyond the walls. The street outside pressed forward with indifferent rhythm. Children skidded on scooters, striking with reckless squeaking with the noise of the vehicles and shirking with reckless joy. A young couple argued in clipped tones, each syllable a spark of intimacy and irritation. The world had now slowed for absence. It accelerated indifference. She passed as a jasmine stallion, hailing the faint perfume curling in the air. The old man looked up, eyes gentle but attentive. For you, Amma, yeah, she nodded, smiling at the absurdity. Small acts of connection pierce solitude like needles of light. A sudden wail drew toward a mother struggling with a stroller. Instinct took over. She steadied it, offering a wordless hand. The mother's gratitude struck her with almost comic intensity. Life, she thought, was absurd and luminous in the smallest ways. Its society's gaze was sharp and unrelenting. A neighbor passed, eyes sliding past her like she was invisible. In a cafe, a young man tuttered at her outdated paradox. She was both invisible and judged, present yet disregarded. A letter from a daughter waited in a bag. A few lines trembled between care and avoidance. I hope you are not lonely. Solitude threaded itself through relationships. She realized yet even in absence, attentive presence could forge intimacy. By the fountain, she watched a small dog chase its tail, absurd and persistent. The humor struck sharply, breaking meditation into sudden awareness. Life's repetition, absurdity, and the fleetingness were not flaws, but features of the world luminous were attended fully. And returning home, she carried fragments of the day, scent of jasmine, child's laughter, gratitude of a stranger, the absurd brilliance of a dog. Solitude had transformed observation into connection, indifference into revelation, and absence into presence. The next chapter it is about the conversation in shadows, and night descended like a patient observer, draping the house in velvet shadows that stretched across the floorboards, curling around furniture like sentient companions. Meera spoke softly to them, whispering fragments of the day, questions unanswered. Do you remember? Do you forgive me? The shadows leaned in, observing her words, echoing her solitude back with a gentle persistence. A creak from the stairs startled her. A neighbor had left a note slipped under the door, complaining about noise from the garden. She smiled faintly, imagining the letter as a tiny duel and life's trivialities clashing with inner reflection. Even minor social friction could become a lens to observe human absurdity, judgment, and expectation. Memories arrived unbidden, faces of friends and colleagues, voices of children, long gone conversations, all pressed at the edges of her mind. Letters she had once sent fluttered like ghosts, apologies, advice, gratitude, warnings never heeded. Regret and tenderness coexisted in her chest, paradoxically sharp and illuminating. She imagined her younger self, radiant with hope and ambition, observing her current quietude. Do you remember who you were? She asked silently, the reflection in the mirror, fractured, softened by decades. Smile knowingly, shadows and reflections merge, absence reveals presence, and solitude magnified awareness. The night deepened, punctuated by a dog barking. Somewhere beyond the garden, a hum of distant traffic, the whisper of curtains brushing the walls. The house responded, floorboards groaned, and teacups hummed faintly, objects bearing witness without judgment. Solitude had become dialogue, meditation, revelation simultaneously, a crucible in which attention and awareness rendered life luminous. And the next chapter, it is about the small mercies. Morning arrived with quiet insistence. Light slanted across the street, illuminating cracks in the pavement, peeling paint and tenacious weeds. Curling between stones, Mira stepped outside, scarf trailing like memory. Immediately aware of the city's pulse, the children's laughter, sharp as sparks, shopkeepers greeting clipped and transactional pigeons fluttering with casual urgency, and a parakeet suddenly flew inside her room. As the jasmine stalled, the old man greeted her with a note she purchased a sprig, tucking it behind her ear, laughing at herself for such a small act of vanity and ritual. The absurdity struck her. Life's tiniest gestures, acknowledgement, attention, care could pierce solitude more effortlessly and effectively that grand achievements. A mother struggled with a stroller, a sudden wail cut through the street. Mira stepped forward instinctively, steadying it. The woman's glance, gratitude, relief, fleeting intimacy hit her with paradoxical warmth. The world was indifferent and tender in the same breath, cruel yet unexpectedly luminous. Later by the fountain, she watched a dog chase its tail. Absurdity, persistence collided in cosmic brilliance. All these things were a kind of recall to our mind. And the next chapter, it is about the weight of what remains. An evening settled over the house like a heavy, familiar shawl. Mira lingered by the window, feeling the pulse of the city beyond the hum of traffic, distant bark of a dog, laughter cutting across rooftops. Each sound reminded her that life persisted, indifferent yet insistent. A letter lay on the table, unopened for weeks, hands trembling. She picked it up. It was from a friend abroad, words thick with care, regret, and longing. And reading aloud, she felt memory and absence entwine, a paradox she had grown used, and the world's distance did not erase its significance, rather, it intensified perception. Regret pressed against her like a familiar companion, opportunities declined, words left unsaid, gestures unmade, all clung to her consciousness, and yet paradoxically, regret testified to engagement, proof that life has been deeply, tenderly, and fully. Mortality hovered softly, patient, unthreatening. She measured each breath, each heartbeat, as if savoring the music of existence. Life's fragility, once terrifying, now rendered the mundane luminous. The faint hum of the teacup, whisper of curtains, the soft creak of floorboards, a memory surfaced. A childhood Fred laughing with the rain-soaked street, her own mother's gentle reprimand for stepping in puddles. Small joys and sorrows intertwined, vivid in recollection. Solitude allowed her to inhabit these moments fully without interference or expectation. Absence had amplified presence. Night deepened, city murmuring beyond the glass. In that stillness, she realized solitude was crucible, sanctuary, lens, and mirror, a way to witness life's fragile, fleeting moments with clarity, attention, and the presence. In the quiet Everything speaks. Next chapter, morning arrived, deliberate, slow, and insistent, light traced and contours of her house and garden, painting familiar surfaces in her shades, mirror moved with reverence, touching objects as one might trace the lines of a familiar face. Dust, stubborn in its own persistence, seemed to murmur stories, whispers of life, intersecting, fading, and leaving subtle impressions. The world outside moved relentlessly. Children tumbled along streets, shopkeepers counted coins, pigeons cooed, Mira observed, fully aware. Solitude has sharpened her perception, magnifying the details often ignored. She noticed laughter, fabric, brushing skin, the faint scent of wet earth, fragments of life made luminous by attention. A letter from a daughter lay open, hesitant, affectionate lines trembling with care and distance. As she read it aloud, savoring the gaps and pauses and unspoken words that carried meaning, even absence at present. Solitude did not preclude connection, it required patience, depth, and attentiveness. And she wandered through memories like a garden of shadowed paths and friends, faces, echoes of conversation, brush of hands, and moments of laughter. Paradox was clear. The less the world acknowledged her, the more vividly she perceived life's textures, absurdities, and tender glimmers. Mortality hovered gently, a companion rather than a threat. Each heartbeat, each breath, each faint creak of the house became a note in a life symphony. Fragility intensified beauty, awareness of impermanence rendered each ordinary moment extraordinary. Evening arrived fragrant with wet earth and faint jasmine, and the street carried laughter and whispers. The world persistent and indifferent. Mira sipped her tea, understanding fully. Solitude was not absence but amplified presence. Attention rendered life luminous, presence and achieved through quiet observation, reflection, and care. In that quiet, she realized she was fully awake, fully alive, fully herself. And the embrace of silence. Next chapter, night draped the house in velvet shadows, the slow and deliberate pressing softly against walls, floorboards, furnitures, as if house itself had learned to absorb. Mira sat by the window, hands cradling a teacup whose warmth seeped into her palms, feeling the weight of decades and the delicate fragility of her own existence. A sudden knock echoed through the hallway. A friend, long estranged, had come with apologies and letters in hand. Their conversation awkward, full of pauses and laughter, trembled between relief and recognition. The world outside had judged her absent, fragile, solitary, but here within the sanctuary of attention and presence, connection persisted. Letters lay spread on the table, and from her friends, distant people, relatives, and it is something, a kind of loneliness she felt. And epilogue, morning arrived, tender, deliberate, carrying with it the promise of ordinary miracles. Light spilled across the garden, painting familiar surfaces in new colors. Dust motes danced in the beams like stars suspended mid-air. Mira moved with care, touching objects as one might touch the lines of a face long loved, long remembered. The world outside persisted. Children laughed, a soft bark of dogs, the rumble of vehicles, yet she no longer measured herself against it. Observation, she realized, was a kind of intimacy, attention, a form of connection stronger than proximity. And with a lot of solitude, she understood was not a curse, not merely refuge. It was a lens through which life's fragile beauty became visible, a crucible forging presence, reflection, and awareness. She sipped her tea, inhaling the scent of jasmine curling in the garden. The world's indifference had not diminished life's brilliance, it had illuminated it. Each detail, sound, scent, sight, memory was radiant. And in that quiet, that attentive, patient observation, she smiled. Life, even in its own solitary, ephemeral moments, was extraordinary. She was fully awake, fully present, and fully herself.